Hello everybody, welcome to my session putting the C back in CSS, modern techniques for today's website. It's been a wild ride for CSS. First, people used it to remove underlines from links in the late 90s when you couldn't do it in HTML. Yes, that's why I learned CSS, and no, I don't think that's a good idea now. Then CSS preprocessors such as Sass and Less came onto the picture, and now there's all sorts of fancy CSS and JS libraries. In this session, we're going to go back to the roots of CSS, and we're going to focus on one of its main features, the Cascade. Here's what I'll be discussing, and hopefully this will work. I'll talk about CSS and JS, just a little overview, what it is, why people like to use it over CSS, and why CSS and how CSS is still relevant today. Oops, let's see. Next, I'll talk about using the BEM syntax. I'll show you how to write componentized styles using blocks, elements, and modifiers, and some examples of how writing BEM can go wrong. And you do not want to write wrong BEM because it can get really, really, really hairy. After that, I'll discuss using Sass to optimize your styles using BEM. I'll go over my personal file structure and then talk about two things that make Sass still awesome. Those are partials and nesting. Finally, I'll bring it all together by talking about the Cascade. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how to use the Cascade with both BEM and Sass. Again, you've probably heard a little bit of this if any of you went to Brian's talk earlier today. I'm kind of talking more about the CSS side as opposed to the CSS and JS side. So that'll be the slight difference there. Everyone ready? Let's go. Yeah. So a little bit about me. I didn't have time to get a picture put up because my hair is different in every single one of my pictures. So I'm just gonna, you can just see what I look like right now. My name is AubreySambor. I am a senior front-end developer at Lullabot. I've been developing professionally for over 13 years and taught myself CSS and HTML over 21 years ago. I've been doing Drupal for about the past decade. I think I started with Drupal 5. And yeah, Drupal is a really fun project. I really like it. You can find me online as Starshaped on Twitter, Drupal.org, and pretty much anywhere else on the internet. I don't really go by anything else. In my spare time, I like to knit. Maybe some of you saw me knitting my socks in some of the previous sessions. I also like drinking tea, and I love dyeing my hair lots of different colors. Right now, it's blue and purple. It'll probably stay that way for a bit, but I've had it pink and a lot of other colors too. It's one of my favorite things to do. All right, let's get started. So, you've probably heard about this thing called CSS and JS. What is it exactly? Why are people using this instead of using old school CSS? What makes this so special? In a nutshell, CSS and JS is one way to write your CSS within a JavaScript application. Instead of creating a style in a .css file, like in this example here of just a simple button, with CSS and JS, you add the style right into your JavaScript component. CSS and JS is not one particular set of styles. A big thing about CSS and JS is that it leverages JavaScript to write your styles, with the ability to pass JavaScript variables into your styles to control them dynamically. This example right here, this one of the button, uses the style components CSS-in-JS library. Here's where the power of CSS-in-JS comes into play. This is a quick example. To add styles for a button with a class of primary, you set a property of primary on this component using JavaScript like this. This example is also using the style components CSS-in-JS library. As you can see, these examples tightly couple your CSS to your JavaScript. I am not a huge fan of this, as I like to keep my CSS, HTML, and JavaScript separate. I'm here to tell you that you can still maintain a separation of concerns while still writing clean and elegant CSS. You don't have to always use CSS and JS. In fact, if you want to utilize the Cascade to its maximum effectiveness, you shouldn't use CSS and JS. So why would somebody use CSS and JS? So here are 3 reasons why people might use CSS and JS. Let's go over them really quickly. The first one is familiarity with JavaScript. You might already know JavaScript. You might have been writing JavaScript for a couple years now. So once you heard about a way to write CSS in a JavaScripty way, you jumped right on board the CSS and JS train. You already know JavaScript, so writing styles this way comes much more naturally than you learning how to effectively write old school CSS. Number 2, keeping components componentized. If you're writing a React component, you might as well keep the CSS right there inside that component. You can be sure your CSS is scoped only to that component it belongs to, so you don't have to worry about CSS leaking into other components. And the last one, tiny, tiny file sizes. Since you aren't loading one huge CSS file on each page, and instead loading styles on a component-by-component basis, your site might load a little bit faster. Theoretically, this will make your site a bit more performant. So all that sounds good. What's the problem? Why am I up here talking about this? Well, Kevin Ball of ZenDev said it best. CSS-in-JS is like replacing a broken screwdriver with your favorite hammer. Sure, CSS-in-JS might be the right thing to use on a particular project, but is it the solution for every project? Is it the solution for most projects? I don't really think so. CSS is not broken. JavaScript isn't the answer to every problem. Use the right tool for the job. However, and this is if you want to utilize the Cascade, and you should want to utilize the Cascade, you shouldn't use CSS and JS. This will be a point I reiterate a few times during this session. Next, I'll go over a few perceived shortcomings of CSS. You'll see that these perceived shortcomings are just that, perceived. So CSS and JS, 3 reasons why CSS and JS became popular were because of these 3 perceived shortcomings of CSS. These 3 are as follows. First one, global namespacing. 2, leaky styles everywhere. And 3, and this is the one that I tend to get on a little bit of a soapbox, is CSS isn't as important as real programming languages. Let's go over all of these one by one. Take a little water break. First, there's a perception that global namespacing needs to go away. Here's a quote from Chris Ferdinandi that I really, really love. The global namespace is a feature, not a bug. The Cascade is a feature, not a bug. One of the biggest arguments against using CSS is that it pollutes the global namespace. What is called the global namespace in other languages, particularly in JavaScript, is business as usual in CSS. The so-called global namespace is a fundamental part of CSS. It's a little thing called the Cascade, you know. It's just that little thing that might be part of CSS. It's just the C, you know. Oops. So why is this useful? The Cascade allows you to keep consistent styles all across your HTML elements on your page. For example, most of the time you'll want your buttons, if you have buttons on your page, like this is an example. For example, maybe you want gray buttons on your page. You know, maybe it's kind of a boring site for the most part. You just want plain old gray. However, you want to have buttons with a class of primary to have a different background color, maybe an eye-searing hot pink, just to make them stand out. If you do that, you could just add that primary class to the button, and the background will turn hot pink. If you had set a font size on that button, that font size will stay the same consistently across all buttons. Again, you won't need to declare that font size every time on the button because it'll cascade down to the class of button primary as well. Again, this is a feature of CSS and definitely not a bug. So this is the second perceived issue of CSS, is that my CSS leaks everywhere. We've all been there. Here we are, minding our own business, adding a fancy new CSS class to a read more link on our project. Something like this, a read more posts about knitting link, which is something I probably have on my website right now. Oh, well, I want to style this read more link differently than the rest of the links on my site, so I'll add a class of read-more to it. Excellent. Let me write my styles and be on my merry way. Oh, wait. What? Why does my read more link have this super awesome animated sparkle background? I didn't write that. Where did that come from? I do a search on my code base for the class of read more, and after a bit of digging through layer upon layer of CSS, I find it. How many times has this happened to you? You think you're being all nice and clever with your CSS naming foo, and all of a sudden, you find that class already exists. Well, you don't find it right away because it's hidden inside of your code base somewhere, maybe a Sass include within another Sass include, and it's all the way down on line like 10,000 of your really, really big and bloated CSS file. Trust me, I feel your pain with this. Another unfortunate side effect of leakage is not knowing when it's okay to delete a class. Unwieldy CSS structure can lead to a lot of fears that the entire site will come crashing down if one CSS class is removed from the code base. Will everything blow up? Maybe. You don't know. The code base is such a mess that you can't tell what's used and what isn't. So every single class stays in the code base for all eternity, destined to remain until the end of time or in 1.5 years when the next site redesign finally comes down the pike. This means CSS is bad, right? We just talked about all these scary things that could happen. Well, no. Proponents of CSS and JS will use the code leak example of a reason to not use CSS. Everything gets so messy and no one can sift through all that code to find one single instance of a class every single time. Well, I'll let you in on something. CSS isn't the issue here. Disorganization is. Incoherence is. Which brings me to my last point, and again, this is where I get soapboxy. CSS isn't as important as real programming languages. I can't even begin to count the number of developers I've worked with in my career who have told me, "Oh, I'm so bad at CSS. It just doesn't make any sense to me." Why is this? Why can some of the best developers who can rock a back-end framework with everything they have curl up in fear when they hear the word Cascade? More importantly, why is this not seen as big of a deal as someone who hides from the phrase arrow functions, like in JavaScript? Mandy Michael explores this in her article, "Is there any value in people who cannot write JavaScript?" In this article, she recalls posing a question to the audience at a conference. In a panel in which she was a part of, someone in the audience asked a question, something along the lines of, "Is there a place in the industry for people who write CSS and HTML?" And you know what? No one in the conference put their hand up to agree with her that there was a place for people who could only write CSS and HTML. No one raised their hand. And why is this okay? Why are JavaScript or PHP or Python that much more important than CSS and HTML? I don't understand why this is okay, and I don't think it should be. An argument I see in regards to this is that, oh, well, CSS is easy. Anyone can do it. Again, to quote Mandy, and I really, really like this quote a lot, which is why it's on the full page, "When every new website on the internet has perfect, semantic, accessible HTML and exceptionally executed, accessible CSS that works on every device and browser, then you can tell me that these languages are not valuable on their own. Until then, we need to stop devaluing CSS and HTML." And speaking of accessibility, recently, maybe about earlier this year, WebAIM put out an accessibility analysis of the top 1 million homepages. Do you know what they found? An average of 59.6 errors per page. This is accessibility errors per page. Users with disabilities would expect to encounter detectable errors on 1 in every 13 elements. And remember, this is detectable errors. Homepages with ARIA averaged 11.2 more detectable errors than pages without ARIA. And, worst of all, 98.7% of homepages had detectable WCAG2 failures. 98.7%. I find this a little unacceptable. Some of this comes from code like this, a div made to act like a button with a submit handler written in JavaScript. This is not accessible, and it doesn't make sense to do this when it could have been as easy as this. The button element has built-in accessibility features, so why throw that all out the window? Well, the person who wrote the first one probably didn't know how to style a button to look similar in all browsers. Can you see that CSS isn't easy, isn't something to just be cast aside as for the real programming languages? No, CSS is important as well. CSS still has a place in modern web development. So let's do a little recap about this section. So CSS-in-JS is a relatively new way to write CSS for your JavaScript application. These are 3 reasons why people use CSS-in-JS. It's familiarity with JavaScript, keeping your components componentized, and wanting to keep your file sizes small. And these are 3 perceived shortcomings of CSS: global namespacing, leaky styles everywhere, and the one that, again, I really like the most is CSS isn't as important as real programming languages. Next up, I will go over a strategy to utilize the Cascade, avoid leakage, and build confidence in your CSS writing abilities. So first up, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview on BEM. Again, I think if you went to see Brian's talk earlier, he did a BEM overview as well. This will just be another way to kind of reiterate how to do it. BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. And what does this mean exactly? What are blocks, elements, and modifiers? Let's dig into these a little bit more. There are a few good reasons to use BEM. 1, they keep your styles nice and neat and organized, making it faster and easier to find styles when you want to update them. 2, it avoids pesky code leaks by keeping to a naming convention. You don't have to think about naming things, because naming things, especially CSS classes, is pretty hard. So why don't you just use the system to keep it a lot easier? And 3, BEM really works nicely with Sass nesting, and I will go over that a little bit more in a later on slide. Now let's quickly go over the main parts of the BEM naming convention. First up is blocks. They are the foundational part of BEM. This is essentially what modern JavaScript frameworks like React would call components. A block is meaningful on its own, and you can a block is meaningful on its own, and it can stand alone without any, it doesn't have to be coupled to anything, to anything else. Let's use an example of a card to demonstrate what a block is. A card can stand on its own without being coupled to other parts of the website. A website can display multiple cards, and each one is a block on its own. And you can see the HTML and the CSS there. So it's pretty easy, right? You just make a card, put some CSS in it, and create a div class of card. Remember, a card is a basic unit, and it may look like any other CSS you've written in the past. Next, here's where the magic starts to happen. Happens in elements. Elements are part of a block, and they have no standalone meaning. You will never use an element on its own. An element is named by first writing the block name, in this case again, the card, and then 2 underscores, and then the name of the element. Again, here is our card again with some elements. As you can see, I added card header and card footer, and they make no sense outside the card block. And then next up, modifiers. They are variations of a block to change appearance, behavior, or state. Modifiers are named by first adding the block name, and then 2 dashes, then the name of the modifier. And here's an example of a modifier in action. Say I want to display a narrower version of our card. I'd simply add a class of CardNarrow to the block element, and now my card block will display narrower. Other examples of modifiers would be adding an active class to a link or a disabled class to a button, which I don't think you should do a disabled class to a button, but in case you want to have disabled styles that isn't exactly disabled, you would maybe do that. The possibilities here are endless. So, what's the downside to BEM? Well, there are 2 major downsides to it. 1, the class names can get really long, and the structure can get convoluted and unwieldy really quickly. You want to see an example of what not to do? Make sure it displays good. Here's an example from a Smashing Magazine article from 2016. It was in an article. This wasn't actually on Smashing Magazine's website. They use a naming convention that adds a C in front of a component name, L for layout modules, H for helpers, and so on, which is fine. But the problem with this is that there's a class that's C, card, body, text, link, and it's pretty long and convoluted, and it's because each grandchild is getting the element of both the parent and the grandparent, so it's this really long, I feel like these are really unwieldy class names, and they don't need to be that long. But didn't I just say to add elements to each block? Well, when it comes to BEM, it's best practice to just add the root block name to each element in the card. BEM isn't tied to the DOM, so you don't need to add every single element name to each child. Here is a better version of the above card component. Much better. You can see that the classes are a lot smaller, they're a lot easier to read and to understand, and you don't lose the meaning. Also, to actually use the Cascade, I removed the classes from the image, paragraphs, and links in the C card body element. If these styles use the same font size, margins, padding, and so on as the default styles, you don't need to redeclare them here. Let the Cascade do the work for you. All right, let's recap this BEM overview that I did. Again, BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. BEM keeps your styles neat and organized, sticks to a naming convention, and works nicely with Sass nesting. And these are the parts of BEM, again. Blocks are the entities that are meaningful on their own. Elements are parts of a block and have no standalone meaning. And modifiers are variations of a block to change appearance, behavior, or state. Next up, let's talk about Sass and how this fits into the BEM convention. So Sass. Sass adds a couple bits of awesomeness to your CSS workflow. Yeah, I know. Some people say it's old and outdated and you don't need it anymore. And while technically you don't need it, with the advance of CSS custom properties especially, you can use those instead of Sass variables. It's still nice to have for two main reasons, and this is why I still use Sass on a lot of my projects. One of them is partials, and the other one is nesting. And no, nesting doesn't have to be a disaster. As you've probably, again, all seen really, really, really terrible Sass nesting where it's a million layers in a row. You don't want to do that. Let's go over why these two things make Sass useful in 2019. Sass gives you the ability to arrange your CSS styles into different files called partials. I use Sass partials to componentize my styles, keeping them separate and easy to find in my folder structure. Here's an example of the folder structure I use for my personal projects. In this example, I group my partials in 3 different folders: base, layout, and components. All of these get imported via the main.scss file, which compiles everything down to one .css file via Webpack or Grunt or whatever I feel like using for whatever project I'm working on. My base folder contains 2 partials, a partial for my variables and a partial for my base styles. My variables partial contains any font includes, such as font face or fonts from Google Fonts, any CSS custom properties I'm using, and any other variables I may need on my site. This file only consists of variables. No CSS exists in here at all. My base partial contains base styles I'd like on my site. I include default styles for my headings, paragraphs, lists, and so on. Most of these styles will be used in the main body content of my site. If I'm writing a blog post and I use H2 headings in my content, I don't want to have to write a CSS class in my content to style each time. I'd rather my H2s inherit the base styles I declare here. My components folder contains any components I may create on the site. If my site has a lot of components, then there'd be a lot of files in here. Since my example site is a simple blog, I only have 2. I have tags and pagination. Each of these components can live on their own and can be incorporated anywhere in my site. For example, I could use the tags component on both my home page and on my individual blog post pages. My layout folder contains, you guessed it, my layout partials. Usually this folder consists of partials for the header, navigation, content, and footer. These partials compose the general layout of my site and are generally only used once. Now that you've learned a little bit more about partials, let's talk a little bit about Sass nesting. I know, again, you've probably heard nightmares about Sass nesting gone wrong. No, I'm not here to tell you that writing styles that compile to something like main content div.header, div.header first, ULLI active, this is too long, this is a good idea, which I have definitely seen CSS like this, and it's not great. However, when bemming your styles up, nesting comes in very handy and results in legible components. And again, this is the use case I advise you use nesting for, and not for a lot of using a lot of specificity. Take our card example from earlier, with a card component and a couple elements for the header, body, and footer. In traditional CSS, these styles would be laid out more like this, with the card element, card header, and card footer all separate like this. I showed you this earlier when talking about BEM, so this should look familiar. Sass has this really awesome thing called the ampersand or parent selector, which is very useful when using Sass nesting. You can use it to add a hover state to a link like this, and this will compile to this right here. As you can see, the hover class was added to the anchor element, all because the hover selector in the Sass portion of the code was nested inside the anchor element. This parent selector is useful in this situation, but it can also be used to keep your Sass components nice and neat and organized. Let's see how to rewrite our card CSS on the previous slide to be bemmed and ampersanded. This is the card block and the header and footer elements written in the BEM syntax using the parent selector. You can see that it compiles to the CSS right here, which is identical to the card CSS from a few slides ago. Writing our styles this way keeps them nice and organized, like I said, and not to mention componentized, and these styles won't leak to other elements if you keep to this naming convention on all your files. Everybody wins. And let's recap this really quickly. Sass can still be useful to write and organize your styles. Two parts of Sass are still especially useful. First one is partials. They give you the ability to arrange your CSS style into different files so you can easily find what you want to edit. Second one is nesting. This allows you to keep your Sass nice and componentized, and it makes your styles easy to read. Next up, I will talk about how the Cascade fits into all this. This section will be a little on the short side, as I talked about all the tools you need to actually be able to use the Cascade with BEM and Sass. I know, I just told you how BEM encapsulates your styles so that they don't override each other. So how do I actually use the Cascade and use BEM at the same time? Well, this is how I do it. Do you remember that base partial I mentioned a little bit earlier, where I said I defined base styles for my list items, especially the LI element? These base styles are used mainly in my main content area of an individual blog post, when I want to add ordered or unordered lists to my post, which I tend to do a fair amount. This way I don't need to manually add a class to each list in my post, and they will be styled just the way I want them to. Here's a screenshot of part of an individual post on my blog. This was a best things that happened in 2018, so it's a list of all the things I really liked the best of my year. This entry uses an unordered list in its content, and these styles are defined in my base.scss partial as follows. Just a simple little LI. As you can see, I'm declaring a font size, a margin, and a line height on my list item element. Next, here is a screenshot of the recent post section of my homepage. I'm also using an unordered list here, but as you can see, the line height here is smaller than the line height that was on my individual blog post. In this case, I've added a class of posts __ item to each list item, slightly tweaking the line height and margin as so. Notice that the font size did not change, yet the font size on both the list item in my blog post and the home page are the same. As you can see right here. This is because a font size was not declared in my posts __ item. So the font size will cascade down and get applied. The only difference between my LIs on my blog posts and the LIs on my recent post list is the line height. Here is another example. Take the narrow card earlier from the talk. In this example, both card and CardNarrow are defined. The card class defines a background, font size, and width, while CardNarrow defines only a width. Since the CardNarrow doesn't define either a background or a font size, these styles cascade down to CardNarrow, inheriting these styles. There's no need for me to redefine either the font size or the background because I know I'll get them from the original card class. This is how I use the Cascade, but also use BEM to keep my styles organized. Again, let's do a little bit of a recap. You can take advantage of the Cascade using BEM. You can define base styles and allow things like font size or margin cascade down to the BEM blocks, elements, or modifiers so you don't have to repeat the same styles throughout your components. You can use Sass, partials, and nesting to keep your styles organized. Oops. These Cascade examples might seem pretty basic to you if you've been writing CSS for a long time. I wanted to reinforce the idea that the Cascade is still an important part of CSS, and some newer developers who have only worked using CSS-in-JS might not understand how the Cascade works. I'm here to tell you that the Cascade is still important and still useful to learn and implement in your day-to-day code. In conclusion, I talked about a lot of things today, and this is a recap of everything I've talked about. First, I talked about CSS and JS, what it is, why people like to use it over CSS, and why CSS is still relevant today. Next, I talked about using the BEM syntax. I showed you how to write componentized styles using blocks, elements, and modifiers, and some examples of how writing BEM could go wrong. After that, I discussed using Sass to optimize your styles using BEM. I went over my file structure and then talked about two things that make Sass still awesome, and those were partials and nesting. Finally, I brought it all together by talking about the Cascade and gave you a couple examples of how to use the Cascade with BEM and Sass. So here's a list of sites I referenced and a credit to Jeff Appleby, whose Reveal.js theme I forked and edited slightly for my slides. Again, a lot of these articles are really interesting, especially the first two, the zendev.com and the Mandy Michael article. Both of those I think are really, really good reading. And thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, I will take a little bit of questions. Yeah.
So if we go back to the card example, and most of the elements that were used in HTML, all of the elements that were used were divs.
Mm-hmm.
With HTML5, you can instead replace some of the divs nested inside the card with header, footer, main, etc. So my question is, does using BEM methodology, is there a way that we can write CSS that instead of adding more classes and more just like basically bloat the HTML file, is there a way to write BEM where it could be the card and then it would target the header, main, and footer nested inside the div?
Yeah. So the question was, within a card, if you have a card element and instead of having divs within the card for the elements, you use header, main, and footer, is there a way for you to not actually put the BEM styles within those because you're already using headers, footers, and main? I tend to still like adding the class. Like, I don't like putting a million classes on things, but I don't think like adding like a card header class is that much more bloat. So I would have no problem with that. I mean, you don't need to actually add the classes in there if you don't want to. I like to do it just to keep everything consistent, so I'm not directly targeting the element itself. I like to target classes when I'm writing my CSS. So.
Thank you.
Yep. Kevin?
Why the double underscores? Do you know? In the BEM class.
So the question was, why are there double underscores, and also why are there double dashes? That is just whoever. That's whatever the person who came up with the BEM syntax. That's just whatever they decided to use. Like, there's not really any rhyme or reason besides this is the standard that I created. So besides that, yeah, not really any reason.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Also on the card example, the way that CardNarrow was defined was and underscore arrow, and that means I assume that that style would apply even if it to anything that had that, even if it weren't a card.
Trying to find the example.
No, the ampersand is just replacing the word card, and so it sets up a
Yeah, I'm trying to find where this is.
CardNarrow,
Yeah, it's
which is just
Yeah, anywhere you
width of X, and that would be have global scope. Is there a reason why you would do it that way instead of ampersand dot ampersand?
So what is the question? Why, like, are you wondering if CardNarrow would become global and would leak into other styles? Is that the concern
Yeah.
you have there?
Yeah.
So the way, and the question is, wouldn't me doing an ampersand dash dash narrow make that a global style? And it gets added to the card class, so the name would be card dash dash narrow, so it would be limited to only using that class. Like, it would those styles would only be applied if you use the class of card dash dash narrow, so that kind of limits the scope of that one right there. Like, it won't, if you use card dash dash narrow in a lot of other places, yeah, anywhere that uses that will get those same styles applied, but it won't go anywhere else outside of that card.
I was just, since the BEM idea seems to be that the card has the class of card and CardNarrow, that the CardNarrow idea is theoretically supposed to only be used if it's a card?
So yeah, a modifier, yes, would only be used if a modifier, you use it with the block that it belongs to. Like, that one is also something that is that probably isn't used as a standalone thing. It's used to modify an existing block. So
Right.
yeah.
So why is the style not written in a way that would enforce that?
I mean, I thought it would enforce that. Like, that's what the definition of the modifier is. Is just like the only thing I wanted to change in the card dash dash narrow is the width would be smaller, and so you would keep the card class on it as well to have all the other styles that you would want in a card. Like, the font size would probably stay the same, maybe the padding would stay the same. The only thing that would change would be the width. So in order to keep all that, you can do it that way. I mean, there's other things you could do, like another strategy would be in a card dash dash narrow. I don't like to do it this way, is you can do extends.card. and that would give you all the styles that a card block would have. I just don't like using extends because it makes my CSS that's generated a lot uglier, so I usually tend to like kind of scope it more to just have, like, again, in the example of a card -- narrow, I just want to put the width in there, and I'd use the card class as well. So it would just be div class of card -- narrow.
So the answer is that the HTML markup and where you're adding the classes is what's governing
Yep.
this restricting the CardNarrow to, it's always going to come inside something that's already using the card
Yeah.
class.
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
So you do have to write your markup right.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Paige. Hi.
So, this is awesome for starting like a new project, but what about those of us with thorny, hairy existing projects? I don't know if anyone has one of those.
Yeah,
Run
I've
out of
had.
control and whatever. Do you have like a suggested starting point, or is some way we can implement, some best practices like right away?
So the question was, what if you have a site with really thorny, tangled up CSS, which I think most people probably have. How do you actually get this started? Do I have any advice or anything to help get people started with using it? Sadly, I don't. I'm trying to think of how I would do it, because I unfortunately have never really been able to refactor these big sites like this. Or big sites with lots of thorny CSS. I think I would probably start utilizing, maybe start componentizing my stuff. And hold on one second, let me unlock my computer. Let's type my password right. That would work. There we go. So let me do this too. Oops, no, whatever. So I would probably start creating components, start maybe building out a Sass, folder structure and partials, and maybe little by little try to break out your components. I had to do a little bit of that at a company I was at a couple of years ago. I had to actually go and we would start recomponentizing our stuff. I was working on a design system, and we used BEM for all of our components there. So I think we were doing that little by little. We would rewrite the components and then swap out the CSS little by little. And that was a huge undertaking, but we couldn't do it all at once. It's kind of like a piece-by-piece thing that you need to do. And it's a lot of work, but after you get a lot of it done, it's a lot easier to work on writing your CSS.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Yep.
Just to add to that, I can honestly say I've had a problem wrapping my head around BEM on large sites, and it gets really, really squirrely. And when you look at it as a block element, it gets very tempting. When you talk about componentizing, making the rule for developers that literally every block should be in its own CSS file, because it reinforces this concept that that's it. You have your root level in this file, and that's what you're working with. And even if you're going into that nested block syntax seems to be what really messes things up. The moment you get double underscore, sub block, double underscore, you're burned. You're going to screw yourself. And to tell every developer, be like, every block is in its own file, period. And maybe, if you need relationships between one block to another, you have it in comments, or, in your design system, you might visually show that relationship.
So was that a question or just a comment?
It's a question. You're going in that direction, I assume.
Yeah.
That seems like every block is its own CSS file, maybe with its own HTML file next to it.
Yep. All right. Yeah. What time is it now? It's 3:13, so I could probably take, or 3:14, I could probably take one more question. Crap, I don't know who to take first. There's too many people with questions. I think you back there had your hand up earlier.
I guess my question sort of piggybacks on what he was saying. You talked about using the BEM style and using modifiers to modify a block. But what about a modifier that comes from an ancestor element? Does that just go against BEM? Do you try to apply that modifier within the context of that block as a modifier to that block, or is there a way to modify a block based on an ancestor element?
So the question was there a way to modify a block? I'm trying to remember what your question was. Modify a block based on its ancestor? Is that right? And when you say ancestor, what do you mean exactly by that?
Parent, grandparent, anything higher element to itself.
So something I've done in the past, and I'm trying to think of how I can explain this, is I would actually create a variable with the ancestor's name, like the parent or the grandparent's name, and I would kind of add that to the class. I would probably have to dig up some examples of that, but I've definitely used that before.
So it becomes a modifier essentially
Yeah.
for that element, so you have to assume that it's going to be inheriting that.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah, it gets confusing. Like, this is a lot for kind of some, like, sometimes it can get pretty hairy and not all of it is incredibly, like, set in stone. Like, BEM is more of a suggestion and not a, you have to do it this way all the time. Like, it's, like, it can be pretty, it can be pretty laid back. So, yeah. All right. I think that's all the time I have. So, again, thank you all very much for coming, and thanks for all your questions.